So welcome everyone. My name is David Hasso and I am an operations lead for Rise First. And I will be moderating today's conversation with Matt Newland. This is our third webinar and we believe this topic is important as there is a lot of there are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of misinformation, and also just it's an area that's a gap for a lot of first generation low income students. In this area of borrowing money, taking out student loans, and then repaying. And we think this is a deeply important topic to cover. And so we're excited to welcome Matt today. Before that, if we can move on to the next slide, I'd just like to cover a bit on who we are, Rise First. So Rise First, our mission is to empower first generation and or low income students and professionals nationwide to achieve their full potential by providing life and career advice, lists of support resources, and mentorship opportunities through a technology platform with online tools. This platform is built for and by Figly students, and you'll oftentimes hear us use this term Figly, and it stands for first generation and or low income. And so it is built by Figly students, providing real life business and professional experience to the students who work alongside us. Really, our goal is to be a one-stop shop for first generation and low income students to have the resources they need, students and professionals to have the resources they need in order to move forward in their academic life and in their career and professional life as well. If you can, we'll move on to the next slide. A bit of an agenda for today. First, after I finish off this introduction, we're going to hand it off over to Matt, who will give us a walkthrough of a presentation that he prepared on navigating the maze of student loans that will cover, he'll also talk a bit about himself and his background, the loan basics and repayment. And after we have that, we'll also move on to a designated Q&A session where panelists and attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions of Matt. I also want to mention, as questions come along, just feel free to shoot them over into the Q&A section on the bottom of the screen. Just shoot over your questions, your comments, and we'll capture those, and either we will ask them during the conversation or we will move them to the end whenever we have the Q&A session. So we want this to be interactive. This will be interactive between, it's really a conversation with Matt and to dive deeper into the wealth of knowledge that he has on this topic. Great, so if we can move on to the next slide. Before that, a disclaimer, right? So the views expressed herein are those of the author and speaker only and do not reflect the views of Rise First, may not reflect the views of Rise First. It doesn't constitute Rise First advice or any business, investment, tax, or legal advice, and it should not be relied on, upon as such. So just an important note to make as we cover some topics here. So I want to give a bit of background on Matt. So Matt Newland is Dr. Matt Newland is a higher education and college access consultant with over 15 years of experience supporting and advocating for first generation and low income students. Matt most recently served as a director of rural initiatives with College Advising Corps, where he worked to increase post-secondary enrollment for students from rural and small town communities. He also established a rural advisor network, which provided resources and training for 200 rural serving advisors across the country. Prior to CAC, Matt worked at both private and public universities in a variety of student affairs and enrollment management positions. At the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University, he established the school's first need-based scholarship, a first-generation student support program, and campus-wide financial literacy initiatives. Prior to that, Matt worked in financial aid at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, where he developed and led workshops for high schools and community colleges to educate low-income first-generation students and families about financial aid and the transition to college. Matt holds a Doctor of Education in Higher Education Leadership from Maryville University, a Master of Education in Higher Education from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and 2 Bachelor of Arts degrees, Communication and English, from the University of Missouri, Columbia. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Matt to walk us through what he's prepared for us today. And I'll hand it over to you, Matt.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for everyone who is attending here today. I hope this will be helpful. And as David said, for me, I don't want this to feel like a lecture. I want it to be an interactive. I really do want it to be a discussion. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the comments, and as they come up, we'll absolutely try to address them. But like you said, we'll have time at the end for Q&A as well. I'm really excited to be talking with everyone here today. This is a topic that is really, really close to my heart because I always told my students when I worked in financial aid, I said, I made every mistake there was when it came to borrowing loans. And so I want my students to not make those same mistakes. And that carries through with me today. So what we're going to cover today is really just the first half of the outline you see here. David and I really wanted this to be a conversation. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And then we're going to have some conversation among ourselves that you'll be able to listen into and learn from. Then we'll go to the Q&A. The other part around in-school and repayment, you'll have access to these slides later on. Because it felt too stiff and too much like I was lecturing at you, I wanted to avoid those, but there will be additional information that will be available afterwards. We really want to focus on kind of the key basic components of this. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to do a little bit more background about myself. Again, my name is Matt Newland. I grew up in Missouri, attended Missouri schools for all of my life. I love living here in St. Louis, and I love my state. Where I grew up, I kind of call a rural adjacent area of the state, where we were only about an hour outside of St. Louis, but it really was an entirely different world. And where I grew up, college wasn't something that was really talked about a lot. My parents didn't go to college. I'm a first generation student from a very low income family, like some of you, I'm sure. My father graduated high school and enlisted right in the Army. My mother never completed high school. She was one class shy when she left to Detroit when she was a young woman and never graduated high school. So when it came time for me to go to college, they were supportive, but there wasn't a lot of guidance or assistance. I remember very distinctly the first day I went to Mizzou, my mom drove me off, dropped me off, and said, you know, good luck, call us if you need anything. And it wasn't a negative comment. It was just she knew she could only help me so far because this was a completely new territory for them. So she wished me well and sent me off on my way. And they were always very supportive for me, but there were still a lot of mistakes I made just because, as we all know, higher education is not set up for people who are first in their families to go to college. The privilege of being a continuing generation student is very real. What I want to share with you here, you'll see on this slide, this is sort of what I'm calling my loan story. So I graduated as an undergraduate in 2005 from Mizzou with about $27,000 in debt. I didn't think that was too terribly bad at the time for what I got: 4-year degree, 4-year experience, 2 bachelor's degrees. I felt that was fine. In reality, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, I probably only needed to borrow about $18,000 or $19,000. I could have gotten through on that, but as I'm sure so many of you know, I was not responsible with my borrowing. I was borrowing for unnecessary things. I was borrowing it to go out to eat with friends or to pay for a fun weekend excursion or something like that. I wasn't limiting my borrowing the way I now tell people to do. So I am coming at this as not only someone who counsels students and parents and professionals on the regular, but as someone who has gone through this process and is still going through this process. When I completed my master's degree in 2011, I had to pay for that using loans. So I shot up quite a bit, up to $42,000, because that was the only way I could get through it, because I was working full time while completing my master's degree. I wasn't doing an assistantship or a fellowship or anything like that. Flash forward to today. As of last week, my balance is down to $18,000. My wife is very, very excited about that number because we just paid off her law school debt a few years ago. So it's coming back down. But again, I come to this conversation as someone who not only has spent 15 years counseling people and helping them work through their student loans, but as someone who's done it and is still doing it myself. And so, like many of you, I'm in the same situation. So I want you to feel comfortable asking whatever questions you feel comfortable about. You'll have my contact information afterwards to follow up as well. So that's just sort of setting the stage that, again, I'm not unaware of the challenges, the confusion, and the mistakes that often occur when it comes to financial aid, because I've been through all of that. So hopefully that allows us to start from a similar spot. So if we move on to the next slide and then keep going. Where I really want to start this conversation, again, I hope it is a conversation, is just making sure we get all the jargon out of the way. One of the biggest challenges for FIGLY students, for non-native speakers, for people who may be first in their family to first-generation Americans, higher education is just overwhelmed with jargon. We use so much terminology that doesn't get applied anywhere else in the world. And so once you get to college, you just sort of got to figure it out. And financial aid is no different. So I want to start out that we all are talking about the same thing today. So here's some just basic financial aid jargon so that we're all on the same page. I do want to note, from my understanding, we have probably a mix of people who are current undergraduates, might be borrowing loans right now. We probably have some people who have graduated recently in the last couple of years, are currently in repayment. I'm going to be addressing things that are going to be pertinent to all populations, really. So I started with my parents and students every time I sat down and said, a loan is a type of financial aid that must be repaid. After that, everything else is pretty clear and straightforward in terms of what you have to do with your loan. But it can be confusing to remember that because you're getting scholarships and grants and work study and things like that. So the loan is something that has to be repaid. And we're going to talk about what that really means here in a second. But essentially, if you are offered $5,000 in a loan, that means when you graduate or when you leave school, you're repaying $5,000. So keeping that in mind. One of the things I wasn't aware of as a student, that a lot of students aren't aware of, is that you can actually check your total outstanding debt balance at any time. And I'll have that link for you here in a little bit so that you can keep on track with how much you're borrowing. It's so easy, and this was something I was guilty of, to think, well, I'm only borrowing $6,000 this year. It's not a big deal, but that's on top of the 5 from the previous year, maybe the 8 you borrowed the previous year. So knowing, we call it your cumulative loan total. Knowing your cumulative loan total is so important because that's the total that's going to be repaid. The next thing is interest. In our young lives, interest is something we don't have a lot of experience with until we get to the student loan part of our academic journey. Interest is the cost of borrowing money like a loan or a credit card or a mortgage or anything else. Essentially, it's interest accrues based on the percentage of the principal amount borrowed. So if you're borrowing that $5,000 and you have a 2.5% interest rate, it's 2.5% of the $5,000 that's accruing as interest. For student loans, it's accruing every month, and we're going to talk more about this. But I want to really hit home that the interest, I don't often let students worry about their loan borrowing. Most times when you borrow student loans, it's because you need it to pay for school, for food, for gas for your car, for shoes, for the necessary things. But the interest is really where students get in trouble. And that was something that really hurt me long term when I wasn't paying as much as I should have been at the time. That interest is constantly capitalizing on your loans once you go into repayment. We're going to look at that. But essentially, the interest is really where you want to be careful of things. Another jargony thing that we don't always explain very well, for those of us who work in financial aid, is principal versus total loan amount. The principal is what you borrowed. So when you look at your award letter or your award package and you accept that $5,000 loan, that's the principal loan amount. The total loan and what your total debt is the principal plus any interest that has accrued since the loan was dispersed. So if you borrowed $5,000 and then 3 years later you're still paying on it, the total loan amount is how much you have repaid, including interest over that time. So that's something else I want you to be very cognizant of, is the principal is not what you're repaying oftentimes. The principal is just what you borrowed. The total amount is what you're going to be repaying on as you go through the life of the loan. Okay, if we go to the next slide, perfect. So need-based. So need-based is something that a lot of people are familiar with when it comes to financial aid in college, because a lot of times you hear about need-based scholarships, need-based grants, and there are need-based loans as well. Essentially, a need-based loan is based on your FAFSA, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Need-based means based on your family's or your personal financial circumstances, you qualify for a need-based loan, meaning your financial circumstances are taken into consideration and the loan has better terms, and we're going to talk about what that means. Essentially, it doesn't accrue interest while you're in school, it has lower interest rate, things like that. So need-based is always a good thing, and you want to always be looking out for those loans. And then finally, there's parent loans. If you're familiar with a parent loan, it's called the Federal Plus or Parent Plus loan. This is a loan that your parents could choose to take out on your behalf. or a parent could take out on the student's behalf. This is oftentimes for a dependent student, including their financial aid award package, as an option to cover the gap between other types of aid and the cost of attendance. We're not going to get into this too deeply today, since we really want to make sure we understand student loans first and foremost. But when we get to the Q&A, if anyone does have questions about their parents' current Parent Plus loans or anything else, we'll definitely have time to talk about that as well. So
if you don't mind me pausing there are a few questions that have come in. One of them, for me at least, this jargon is really important, and it's really important to understand this as you're beginning in your college career. Because I know for myself, right, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. I didn't know what a Parent Plus loan was, and sure, there are resources outside. I can Google it, but I think there was a unique opportunity for someone to walk me through that process when I first started in college, right? Because it just wasn't known to me that I needed to aim to get a loan that had the lowest interest, or certain loans that maybe I should stay away from. And there's no one there to really walk you through that process and those definitions. I know there are sometimes some counseling that occurs, and that's through the servicer, some like entry counseling. But even then, that's not necessarily as helpful as sitting in front with someone and having that conversation. Any input to add there, from your experiences in working in the financial aid office, of best practices that maybe universities and colleges can adapt, but also some strategies for students to get to learn up on these items before starting that borrowing journey?
David, you're absolutely right. Everything you just said is the entrance counseling kind of in the financial aid field is it's not, I don't want to make light of it, but we understand how not effective that is in terms of educating the borrower, which is its purpose. I had to do it 100 times with different students and parents, just making sure that they walked through it and read through it. And it's like reading stereo instructions. It's not easy to digest. It's often you're doing it before you borrowed any loan, so you also don't really have a firm understanding of the context. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But what I will say, and something I want to repeat many times through this conversation, is ask questions. I know sometimes it's hard and it's absolutely intimidating. The financial aid offices, again, having worked in there for 12 years, the financial aid office is one of the most intimidating offices on the campus, of your college or university campus, and I absolutely understand that. But you learning to advocate for yourself and ask those questions, even if you're embarrassed or you feel afraid to ask it, it's such good practice for later in life. It took me until junior year really to just start walking up to the financial aid office or the cashier's office or to a faculty member and just start asking for things I need or ask for clarification. It takes a while, but I really want to encourage you, ask questions. That's absolutely what they're there for. So to answer your question, yes, your financial aid office is there for you, and they need to be there for you. And for anyone who's already graduated, most financial aid offices will still talk with you as a former student, as an alumni. So if you went to Texas Tech, let's say, call the Texas Tech financial aid office. Say, hey, I graduated 3 years ago. I'm struggling with my payments. I'm not understanding things. Can someone talk through this with me? I'm willing to bet they're going to have some counselor or someone who's willing to help you. It's sort of like with career services, you sort of have a lifetime access.
Yeah.
Most financial aid offices are the same way. Go in, ask for help, and if you're not getting the best help, advice, or someone isn't being patient, come back and ask to see someone else, because this is about you getting the answer. And keep in mind that the financial aid office is there for you. You're not there for them. So if you're not understanding something, ask questions. Keep asking for clarification until you really get it.
Gotcha. That's great. And yeah, that definitely answers my question. Another question that came in was around the interest rate, right? So the goal is the interest rate is what really hurts you. Can you control that? Is there, right? So if you're borrowing a loan from the government, is there a way for you to control for that interest, or is it just you get a different interest depending on your credit score? How is that decided?
Excellent question. No, you have no control. None of us do. It's set by Congress. So yeah, honestly, that is a really great question, and something that's always so hard to explain, because you have no control over the interest rates, and the interest rates are fixed for each individual loan. But every year they change. They fluctuate a little bit. So the loans I had as an undergraduate, every loan had a different interest rate because each year they changed slightly, right? but they are fixed for each individual loan. So that right there, that's sort of the confusing world we're talking about. Is I have to know that each loan has a different interest rate. They're each fixed, but there's no consistency between it. Like it is just very confusing. That's why these conversations are good. But no, you don't have any control, unfortunately. Your credit score does not come into play with it, except until you get to graduate school and maybe you're applying for a graduate plus loan, which in case it would look at your credit score. But no, the interest rates are set by Congress. They are what they are.
Gotcha. Great. And so we have many more questions coming in, but I'll let, we'll continue in the conversation. And
okay, terrific. Yeah. And please keep them coming. This is great. Hopefully we'll touch on some of them, but if we don't, keep them coming.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the types of loans. Essentially, there's two types of loans. There's federal loans and there's private loans. Federal loans is always what you want to go after. This was one of the things I'm so fortunate that I did not borrow private loans as an undergraduate. Fortunately, because I didn't know they existed. If I did, I probably would have borrowed them because my stepdad would have seen a lower interest rate and he would have encouraged those. Thankfully, we had no idea that they even existed. Federal student loans are based on your FAFSA eligibility. And so if you submit a FAFSA, you're enrolled at least half time, you're eligible for sometimes the subsidized loan and then the unsubsidized Stafford loan, each of which have different interest rates and different components, which we're going to talk about next. But those are the federal loans. Those are the ones with the fixed interest rates, with repayment options, with flexibility. That's what you want to go for. Then there are the private student loans and the private parent loans. The biggest difference is that while private loans often have a lower interest rate because it's tied to the market, they have less favorable repayment options. And that's really where I always counsel my colleagues, my peers, students, and parents. You want to think long-term. Don't think short-term payoff of, great, it's got a low interest rate. If you graduate, begin working, and you can't make that repayment, that low interest rate isn't going to do you any favors if you have to pay $900 a month, right? So I always tell people, think long-term, don't think short-term gain. Long-term, the federal loans almost always are going to be the best option for you. Now with private loans, which come from a bank, a credit union, a private lender, something like that, they typically are similar in that you don't have to repay while you're in school, those types of things. And you do have the option for refinancing them that you don't have with federal loans. But those refinancing options don't always, again, make up for the benefits that you have with the federal loans. So that's where we're really getting into the weeds. We might get into that later in the conversation, but I always tell people federal loans should be your should be your primary borrowing option. If you've exhausted your federal loans and you think you need to borrow a private loan, that's when you need to have a conversation with me, for example. I'm happy to talk with anyone at any time. Talk to your financial aid counselor, talk to someone else, a trusted peer or colleague, because you want to avoid those if you possibly can. All right, so let's talk more specific about the federal loans. You have the direct subsidized loan and the direct unsubsidized loan. Now, for those of you who are currently in college, even if you only have, if you're in your final semester, it's important that you know what type of loan you have when you're looking at your award package. Every university, every college and university, unfortunately, labels these a little bit differently. Sometimes it'll read direct subsidized loan. Sometimes it'll read direct sub loan, or sometimes say direct Staffords. They change the terminology around in every award letter. But essentially what you're looking at is subsidized versus unsubsidized. What's the difference? Subsidized is need-based. That means that's the better loan. That's the one you always want to accept first before accepting any unsubsidized loans. The subsidized loan has deferment or interest deferment, where the student is not responsible for any interest while they are in school. So that's first and foremost the best thing that you can hope for with these loans, is you're not responsible for any interest that accrues. It will continue to accrue, but you're not going to pay on it. The Department of Education pays that for the student. An unsubsidized loan is not need-based. So the student is responsible for all interest that accrues on the loan from the time the loan is dispersed. Again, you're not paying till after you leave school, but that interest is always accruing. Again, interest. It's just, I'm going to keep beating that drum, but that's really the important thing. It's not the principal, but that interest that can easily get out of control. So when you're looking at your award package or you're looking at your loans, subsidized is the better loan, unsubsidized is the less good loan. And when it comes to repayment, typically it's the reverse. The unsubsidized is the one you want to pay first. The subsidized is the one you want to pay second for those same reasons. So let me pause there. David, did any pertinent or really important questions come in on that? Because I know that can sometimes be tricky.
Yeah, and so that is for example, I mean, I myself had to make the choice between those two, and I think for as an example, I first accepted a subsidized, and then after that it was like, can I pay maybe the amount that has to be paid in unsubsidized just to prevent myself from having to take on that unsubsidized loan. But a question that came in on, and this was from some of the previous conversation around, if let's say if you've graduated, you had for some reason you had to, and I know maybe the conversation doesn't involve Parent Plus loans right now, but let's say you graduate and you have a loan with a high interest rate from the federal government.
Mhm.
If you refinance for a lower interest rate, maybe with a private lender, what are your thoughts on that? Is that a strategy that people should adopt if they feel comfortable paying off that maybe a higher amount? What are your thoughts around that?
Unfortunately, you can't refinance federal loans. And I have a lot of students and parents that ask this all the time. The private loans can be refinanced through things like SoFi and not Lending Tree, but there's another one that'll come back to me. SoFi is sort of the biggest player. Federal loans cannot be refinanced. So the interest rate is the interest rate. The only similar option you have is consolidation. And this is what I did with my undergraduate loans, is I consolidated them so that I had one interest rate, one loan, one payment amount every month, right? That's the benefits of consolidation. It brings all of those individual loans together. It's one new loan, one interest rate. That's an option, but because it's the way it's calculated, it's definitely not refinancing. But because of the way it's calculated, it doesn't always work out in the best instances. And this is something, especially with my graduate students, we would sit down and run scenarios with the repayment calculator in my office. But if you have outstanding student debt, and you've got a wide range of interest rates, maybe you have a 7% and then a 3% because of when you went to graduate school and undergraduate, you might look at consolidation, but I would sit down and talk with a financial aid counselor. Contact me, I'm happy to talk through it with you as well, to find out the best option. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Great, thank you for answering.
Absolutely.
Yep, that was one of the questions now.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, so let's kind of look at the life of a loan, right? Okay, so this blue arrow you're seeing is sort of the life of a loan when it's dispersed. You look at the red on the far left side of the screen. The loan is borrowed. Let's say we're just talking about one loan for 1 year, right? So let's say in your senior year, you borrow a loan in the fall semester and it's $5,000. You're enrolled until you reach graduation, right? You graduate, everything's exciting, you're starting to look for work. Then you enter your grace period. Every federal loan has a 6-month grace period where you're not required to make any payments on your loans. It's sort of the get your feet on the ground, relocate if you have to, find your job, get everything going. Because as COVID has shown us, it only takes 6 months for us to fix all of the world's ills, right? So 6 months should be more than enough time to get your life on track. But that 6 months is really there to give you that buffer. So this is what's called deferment. Your federal student loans are in deferment during enrollment and during your grace period, which you see on the left side. Repayment begins in month 7. So after the 6-month grace period is exhausted, then repayment begins on that $5,000 loan. And then repayment goes until you pay it off, and then you have a huge celebration and you're really, really excited. I'm hoping to have that celebration within the next 1 or 2 years for my loans. During that time, that's when you're repaying your loan, and that $5,000 ideally should be going lower and lower and lower every month, depending on how you repay. Every federal student loan has a standard repayment plan of 10 years. So when you get to repayment in month 7, your monthly payment is going to be based on the principal you borrow, that $5,000, and then the projected interest you're going to pay over 10 years. And then they just divide that over 120 payments, and boom, that's what you're paying every month. So let's say it's $98. Okay, so every month you've got to pay $98 until the loan is done. Now, the good news about that is it's a manageable payment. The bad news is you're paying for 10 years, and sometimes you just want to get on with your life. And it really is that interest that hurts students. So if you have a $5,000 loan and the interest is accruing, you want to pay more than that $98. It's so critical. Even if you're paying $100, that extra $2 makes a big difference, because any extra money you pay goes towards the principal. And as we talked about at the beginning, the principal is what you actually borrow. I want my students to repay as close to what they borrowed as possible, rather than borrowing $5,000 and repaying $6,100, right? that interest is what can happen, and we're going to look for some examples of that. So if we go to the next slide, one more, there should be a similar slide that the next one should have something that looks similar to this.
I think it's oh, there we go.
There we go, perfect. So again, going back to this interest, for a subsidized loan, the interest accrues from repayment to celebration date of the loan is repaid. But the unsubsidized, that lower bracket you're seeing, from the day the loan is dispersed to the day it's repaid, it's accruing interest. So again, you can quickly see why that unsubsidized loan should be the last one you borrow and the first one you repay. So for example, my wife and I have been paying as much money as we could every month to my student loans. In fact, what we did was, I mentioned we were paying off her loans more quickly. So because with law school, she had much larger debt, we wanted to get rid of it and get done with it. Once we paid off her loans, we were paying, I think, $500 a month on her loans, which is an insane amount, but it's what we had to pay. We didn't just start spending that money every month. We took that $500 and added it to what we were already paying on my loan. So that's why I'm down to the amount we are, is because the last couple of years, we've just been pounding it with payments, and we've just been saving and scraping and doing everything we can to get those loans lower. Because every month I can see my loan just drop dramatically like I've never seen it before, because we're paying so much more. If you're paying just the standard payment, just what they tell you to pay, you are going to pay for that 10 years. And I want you to get out of debt as quickly as possible, so you can go on to the rest of your life, start a family, buy a house, you know, move to Fiji, whatever it might be. I want you to move on to those things and not be stuck paying your student loans.
That's great. That's wonderful. And a question on that, I think as you enter repayment, do you have an option to pay either the principal and or the interest? And if so, and I think I'm asking a leading question here, but should you focus on paying the principal? Am I understanding, you know, that repayment, do you have the option to pay either for the interest that's been accumulated or the principal?
That's a really great question. So no, that's excellent. So let's go back to that $5,000 example. Let's say you get out, again, $98 is your monthly payment. You can, that $98 is calculated where first it's going to pay off any interest that is accrued in the previous month. So let's say it's $17, and I'm making this up, but let's say $17 is applied towards the principal. Let's do 18 because I just realized I don't want to do math. $18 is applied to the principal, to the interest, and then the remaining $80 is applied to the principal. So that's how it's split up, and that happens automatically. That's the way it's calculated with those 10-year 120 payments. Again, let's go back to, you pay more. You want to pay $120 every month because your first job out of college is actually looking good, or you're living at home saving money. All excellent things. That extra $22 you're going to pay is going to go towards that principal. So it's going to take the $98, pay off the interest, and then everything else you pay is going to go towards that principal. Now, normally when you pay online, you have to specify that. So when I pay Great Lakes every month, I have to specify, apply to my principal, apply to my principal. But that's the way you're going to get it lower, because then what happens the next month, right? Your next month's payment is actually going to be lower because you've paid more towards the principal, meaning the interest that accrues is lower. So it's the cycle that really, really works for you. The more you pay, the better. Another point I want to make while we're on this is you don't have to pay that same amount every month. So let's say you just get a really big birthday present from a relative, or you get a bonus at the end of the year, or you just saved a lot of money one month because you didn't go out to eat a lot. You can make payments in whatever amounts you want any month above and beyond that $98. So as long as you're paying the minimum, you're fine. You can pay $120 one month, $98 the next, and then $300 the next month. So you can fluctuate your payments as however you want, as long as you're paying the minimum. Just always be trying to pay as much over that as you can.
Gotcha. Great. That definitely answers the question. And another question that came up is, during this deferment period, can you pay towards your loans? And if so, you know, does the interest rate kick in during this time? So I'm assuming the grace period means that the interest rate doesn't kick during this time, but can you pay towards your loans during this period?
You absolutely can. I typically tell students not to, though, because yes, while interest is accruing, if you begin repaying during your grace period, you can be, that can trigger repayment to begin. So if you're paying in the third month, it might be fourth month, hey, you're ready to start paying, let's get it going. And you don't want to lose that. Take advantage of those 6 months. Pay the interest at least that you're seeing accruing, but I wouldn't make full payments because that's going to, you know, confuse them, and the system might think you're ready for repayment. use those 6 months, save up some money, and then maybe make that first payment, a couple of dollars bigger, maybe 30, 40, $50 bigger, and then go back to those regular payments after that.
Gotcha. Great. Awesome.
Terrific. All right. So we're going to do a couple of slides, as if I haven't said it enough, of why interest is so important in this conversation. This gives you some examples. For example, there's a really great graphic that I borrowed from Student Loan Hero, which is a terrific website if you haven't looked at it. Shows you how much you are borrowing each year versus how much interest is accruing during the school year or during your enrollment period if you're doing a 4-year program, right? So your first year you borrow $5,500, $997, almost $1,000 is going to accrue just while you're in school from freshman year to graduation, right? So let's just sit with that for a minute. You're borrowing $5,500, but when you leave school, you already owe $6,500, right? So that's where interest it really becomes the enemy, it really becomes the beast. Now, all through this, as we talked about, you're not required to make any payments on subsidized, unsubsidized, any of them. But if you can pay even just a little bit, even pay towards your interest on that unsubsidized loan, man, it is going to make a huge difference for you when you leave school. And that's something I try to tell my students and parents as often as possible. Again, it doesn't have to be every month. Maybe it's every couple of months when you work enough hours, or if your parents are helping when they have enough hours or enough money in their bank account. Anything you can pay on the interest in your loans is just going to help you long term to make it much more manageable when you begin repayment later on. So that's one image. If we go to the next slide, this is another way to look at it is, let's say you have a principal of $10,000. This shows you kind of 4 different scenarios of repayment. So if you have no in-school payments, you'll repay, when you all said and done with that loan, $6,900. So you borrow $10,000. After 10 years of repayment, you're paying back $16,920, right? Again, insane. But that's how the interest works. But even if you're just paying $25 a month while you're in school, you're going to save $500 a month. If you pay $50 a month while in school, you're going to save almost $900. And then if you're paying the full principal and the interest, you're going to save over $3,500 over the life of the loan. So right there, that's the part that I didn't know about. I had no idea while I was in school that interest was accruing. I had no idea what interest meant. I had no idea why it would make my life so miserable once I left school. But this image to me was what really drives it home of why it's so important. Again, it doesn't have to be every month. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but anything you can pay towards it, I absolutely encourage you to do. And then if we go to the next slide, just another example of paying $100 versus $500, how big of a difference it really goes to and how that's broken down. So again, look on the left side. If you pay $100 on this one's 10, but if you're paying $500, the same $41 goes to interest, but guess what? Now you're paying $450 towards the principal. I mean, think of what that does for your total loan balance when the next month your total debt is $450 less than it was. It's going to decrease how much interest is accruing every month, making your next payment have an even bigger impact. And that's really what it is just trying to get ahead of the game as much as possible and not giving the federal government any more of your money than they already are going to get, right? So just pay as much over time as you can. I had friends who were smart in their 20s and stopped asking for birthday, holiday presents, all that. It was, I need cash. Just give me cash, or here's my login account. Go make money, go make payments towards my student loans. And I think that's really smart too, because that interest can feel so overwhelming, especially for those of us who have, debt in the 40s, 50s, 60s and above. That's what really comes into play. Okay, Dave, let's pause there before I do this last slide. Any other questions that have come in?
So no other questions have come in, but I think it's ingrained in me now that interest rate is definitely the enemy, and you wanna pay that off. You want to pay whatever you can towards your student loans while you are in college. I guess my mind immediately. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, but it's ironic, right? Because then when we're talking about the other side of financial literacy, about saving, investing, stocks and bonds, interest is the greatest thing that has ever been created, right? Is because you put $5,000 in the bank and in 10 years, you've got $15,000 or $20,000. It's crazy depending on the perspective and what you're using it for. It's the greatest thing or the worst thing.
Yeah, that is great. And so one question came in, from your experience, are loans negotiable? or either the amounts or the interest? Is that something that you can talk through with someone, and there'll be some leeway, or is it set in stone? This is the amount you need to pay towards college. It's what you're gonna have, and then the interest rate, as we've learned, there's no control over.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if there's anything else behind the question, but for the most part, in 99% of circumstances, no, there's no negotiating your loans. The only thing I can see, and this might be true, I had it many times with my students, and this might be true for some people on the webinar, is unless you have circumstances where you just need more loans. Let's say the university or college says you've exhausted your loans, but you have more eligibility based on your cost of attendance, where you could submit a special circumstances appeal. So it's not a negotiation, it's basically just appealing for more loans that you would otherwise be eligible for. But if a student's in that situation, typically they know if they're in that situation.
Gotcha. So another question that came in is there a healthy amount of loan debt versus the scary loan debt?
Yeah.
Is there a threshold that you think you should have? Does it depend maybe on what you anticipate your job being after college? Or someone just is asking, just in your professional opinion, what would you think that is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so funny because it makes me think back to when I went to college, and then when I started working in financial aid. When I went to college, the sort of rule of thumb, the saying went, don't borrow more in total than you expect your first year salary to be when you leave school, right? And that was really, really good back then. But now with the cost of tuition, even going to a state school, it's not really feasible, especially for a lot of us where the loans are the only way we're getting through college, right? Like we don't have an option to say, okay, I'll keep it limited. I won't borrow more than $50,000, because if you want to go to college, like you just said, sometimes you don't have an option. You got to borrow loans. I mean, that was my situation. I needed to graduate in 4 years. The only way to do it was my parents couldn't help, so it was more and more loans. So that used to be sort of the saying, but by the time I started working with financial aid, that sort of went out the window. There's no guidelines now, because the cost of tuition is so high, and different career fields vary so widely in what they pay. So if I'm talking to an engineering student or a pre-med student, it's going to be a bit of a different conversation, knowing that they're probably going to go on to a graduate degree, or are definitely going to go on to a graduate degree, knowing that eventually they're going to be in a comfortable situation where they can repay their loans, even if they get up above that $50,000, $60,000. The 50 or 60 for me is kind of what I always have used as sort of are we talking big dollar amounts or low dollar amounts? Not that $45,000 is a small amount, it's not, but the 50, 60, 70 and above, that's when I really have intense conversations with borrowers, because I want to make sure they fully understand things. So again, an engineering, pre-med, pre-law student, I'm not going to be as worried. But if you're in arts and sciences like me, I wish someone would have sat me down and said, hey, you're studying English, right? Are you sure you want to borrow to put a down payment on a car? Which I did. I'm not thrilled with it, but I love that car, so it worked out okay. But I would have more conversation. When I worked with social work students at WashU, it's a private institution. Tuition was very high every year, and they're going into a field that doesn't pay a lot of money traditionally. And so I would have conversations of how passionate are you? What's your undergraduate debt? Is your family helping? Are you planning to relocate to an expensive city? So going back to the root of the question, no, there's not one like truth, this is what you should follow. It's more conditional. What's your situation? What is your degree? What's your intended career field? Where do you plan to live? Is your family helping in any way? All of those things go into it. And again, that's a conversation I'd be happy to have with people individually.
Great. That's a great answer. And on that note, there are opportunities for loan forgiveness, right? Is that so? And this is specifically for those who are working in fields as you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit more about any advice that you have there, or any knowledge that you have there?
Yeah. So public service loan forgiveness is something I worked with almost all of my social work students with, because they typically were going into the nonprofit public service field. But the way public service loan forgiveness was designed back in 2008, I think it was now. No, 2006, I forget, was that anyone who works in public service for a minimum of 10 years has the remaining loan debt forgiven, right? That's it, free and clear. It's forgiven. So you work 10 years, even if you still owe $60,000, it's forgiven, it's done, you're out of there. So it's a great program in theory. In practice, it's been it's been rough, to say the least, in the last couple of years since the first group of students began to qualify, or borrowers began to qualify. There's a lot of, you have to submit certain documentation, you have to submit certified copies of things, you have to make a certain number of payments and a certain type of repayment plan that isn't a standard repayment plan. So it's a great option if you're going into public service, but I always told students and continue to tell them, treat it as best case scenario. Still repay your loans as if you're paying them yourself. If after 10 years it gets forgiven, great, that's everyone's happy. But don't count on it, because there's a lot of things that could change with that program. So again, that's something I'm happy to have individual conversations, but I really encourage people to talk to their financial aid counselors or debt management counselor at their college or university to really walk through, because there's a lot of fine print with that program. The other option is in some of the alternative repayment plans, the income-driven repayment plans, which you'll see at the end of this presentation. You can apply for and go into an income-driven repayment plan where it's based on your annual income. And at the end of 20 or 25 years, the remaining amount can be canceled, not forgiven. And it's an important distinction, because canceled means you're paying taxes on whatever the government cancels. Public service loan forgiveness, it's free and clear. So that's really important distinction. But it's also that's happening after 20 or 25 years. And I would love if no one I know or work with is paying on their student loans for that long. So it's an option, it's out there. But again, I would do a lot of digging and a lot of research before considering any of those.
Great. And one overarching question that I think is important to ask, and it's, why is it important to pay off your debt, your student loans, as soon as possible? I think sometimes there's a misconception. It's loan, it's fine. It's fine if I end up paying it for 20, 30, for the rest of my life. Just maybe an overarching opinion that you have on why it's important to pay off your student loan would be helpful in this conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, it comes down to, because you have other things you need to and should spend your money on. I mean, it really is, you want to get rid of this debt, and because you don't want to be repaying, for me, it's not even the length of time, it's the amount that you're repaying. It's that, again, that interest. I know I've said it a million times, but to me, that's what I get more heated about with my students and parents on their behalf, is because it's not that you're paying for 10 or 15 or 20 years, it's how much more you're repaying than what you actually borrowed. And that's what really hurts people. And that's why so many borrowers who are currently in repayment are struggling so much, is because their debt has ballooned so high. It is still, in terms of your credit report and future borrowing, it's still seen as quote unquote good debt, if there is such a thing, which is arguable. It's not a negative thing when you go to apply for a mortgage, or if you're getting a credit card or applying for a car loan. It's not going to hurt you significantly unless you have massive amounts of debt that you haven't been paying on, and maybe your income is lower. You're making not as much as like the average income a year. So it's not going to hurt you necessarily unless you're not paying on it. I just don't want people repaying more than what they have to.
Gotcha. Completely understand. And so a question that I have for you now is, are there any common questions that you receive on this topic that maybe we haven't covered yet? Anything that you think, as we're nearing sort of the end, and it's crazy how much time has passed by already, but as we're nearing the end, any questions that you feel are common or are very, very important and maybe we haven't asked yet throughout this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one, so on this last slide, which hopefully people have had a chance to look at, one of the things key for people who are currently in school, or if you're thinking about grad school, going back to school, remember, you don't have to borrow loans if they're offered to you. You don't have to borrow them at all, or if you are borrowing, you can borrow less than the full amount. So you're offered a $7,500 loan and you only need $1,500 to pay your balance, just borrow $1,500. You can always come back and request more loans later on if you don't accept the full amount, but borrow as conservatively on the front end and then come back and ask more. And that's what it took me a lot of educating my students to understand. That let's be careful, let's borrow little, and then if a new fee comes up, you have to buy an additional book, your car breaks down, then come back and ask for the additional loan money. But that way you're minimizing the debt, you're keeping that interest from accruing while you're in school. Similarly, while you're out, once you're out of school, or if you are currently in repayment, try to do something similar by really working from a budget. This is something we're not really taught about. And this is something I just did a presentation about this on Tuesday, about how important creating and sticking to a budget is. cut out extraneous unnecessary spending. So if that means getting rid of, one of your streaming services, or cutting back on going out to eat, or, wearing clothes for an extra season, not buying new clothes, just find where you can cut corners and dump money into your student loans. That's really what it's about. It's just, even for a few years, when my wife and I got married, we both had student loans, and we sat down, we were honest about it, and we said, okay, what can we cut out individually so that collectively we're paying as much as possible on our student loans? And it took a lot of just honest calculating and figuring out our budget so that we were putting as much there. And that now has opened us up where we can have some more of those things, and have some more freedom, because we've spent so many years restricting ourselves. So that's the other side when you're repaying, is working from a budget, sticking to it, cutting out any purchases, expenses, costs that you don't absolutely need, and instead putting that money towards your student loan. I've told people a lot of times, when I was in college, Netflix was just launching, which I know dates me quite a bit for most people on this call, but it was just launching. It was actually in beta stage, and I was one of the early adopters of Netflix because I'm just such a movie obsessive. So I had Netflix before a lot of my friends did, but then once I left college, I needed every single penny to go towards my loans. I had to cut it out, and it was heartbreaking because that's when it was taking off and everyone else was getting on the board. And so it's definitely that FOMO experience. But just figuring out things you can do to minimize the debt in school, anything you do to make more payments when you leave school, that's the best advice I can give.
So really important question now. Did you go back to Netflix? Do you have Netflix now?
Oh God, yeah. Oh, who can live without Netflix? No, but it is funny because my wife, everything is, obviously with the pandemic, everything is going to HBO this year in 2021. Yeah. So I had to convince my wife to let us get an HBO Max subscription. So I actually went to her and said, it's $15. If we cut down on Netflix and cut out CBS All Access, it's a wash. We looked at our budget, and we are now proud subscribers to HBO Max. But those are the things, even as someone in his late 30s, those are the choices you have to make, because that's just life.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the last point that you were talking about is just pouring as much money as you can into your loans. We received a question on, what do I do if I get a refund check? And this is especially relevant now during COVID, when certain students, or people who have already graduated are getting those refund checks. And I would assume your answer is probably pour that into loans if you can. And those are big checks that you're probably being able to put into loan repayment.
If you can, absolutely. But I'm also very cognizant of everyone's situation is different. So like when I was in my early 20s, those tax refund payments, I needed those. I had no choice but to use those for just rent, utilities, and things like that. So everyone has a different financial circumstance. Your student loans, if you're not able to put that extra money towards that because you need to pay rent or down payment on a car, something like that, I absolutely get that. I don't want to detract from anyone's life circumstances. So in a best case scenario, yeah, you're putting it towards your loans. But if there's another, emergency expense like a rent payment, that's obviously what it should go to. Your loans are fine to coast a little bit longer if you absolutely need to.
Gotcha. Great. And so, yeah, we're nearing the end of this conversation. There has been a lot of good material covered, and I know for myself, just having graduated college in May, and on this journey of repayment, and it is something that can feel overwhelming at times. But I know, during this conversation, I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you also opening up yourself. Just to receive emails from people and receive conversations, just to have conversations with people in this topic. So there are a lot more questions, and there are questions that we won't get a chance to answer, but I'm just deeply grateful, and I'm sure a lot of the other attendees on this session are also grateful to have had this opportunity. It might even mean a second session, who knows? But
we can really dive into the nitty-gritty of repayment.
No, absolutely, but we want to be respectful of your time. But any last comments that you have, Matt, for the attendees, those who have joined this session today? Any last thoughts as we move into the end of this conversation?
First, I just want to say again, thank you for attending, both for myself and for you. I want to congratulate you for attending, because I know, especially on a Saturday afternoon, this is not the most exciting, this is not the most fun, upbeat topic. So I appreciate you taking time. I think that speaks to how committed you are to yourself and your own success. So congratulations for that. But yeah, just thank you for spending time. And again, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. It's so important, even if it feels embarrassing, even if you feel insecure about it, even if you feel like you might get judged, you're not. You're asking the right questions, and that's what you need to do. And that's what your financial aid office is there for. That's what your loan servicer is there for. Ask questions and get the answers.
Great, that's absolutely wonderful. And then one last comment just from a Rice First side. For students that are joining us today, for professionals who are joining us today, please follow us on our social media channels. Follow us. You know, we have an Instagram, we have a Facebook, we have a LinkedIn. Any social media that you have, we're there, Rice First. And so please follow us to keep up to date with the webinars that we have. Future webinars, just future resources. We also recently started a newsletter to send out to students with professional opportunities, students and professionals with professional opportunities. So that's the best way to stay up to date with what's going on with Rice First and any other guests that we're also having for webinars. And to sign up for that newsletter, go to our website, and on the main page, there'll be an opportunity there for you to input your email. And so thank you again, Matt. We really appreciate you having this conversation with us. I know personally I've learned a lot. And I really do appreciate it. And I probably will follow up with a couple of emails myself on topics that I have questions about. But truly, thank you so much. And then again, thank you to all the attendees who joined us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. You have a great day. And yes, on the screen, there is Matt's contact information if you want to note that down. And yeah, one last thing. This webinar is recorded, so you will be eventually able to see this webinar on our website and under the webinar section. So wonderful. Thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful Saturday evening, Saturday afternoon, and take care.